Welcome back to HTP Storytime. Last time we left Catherine Hayes cleaning up her fresh crime scene, and tonight we join her accomplices in getting rid of the evidence. Unfortunately, sneaking off with a head in a bucket is not an easy job. Having no TV crime shows to reference, the accomplices and Catherine's alibis were paper thin. But since the parish police force of the time didn't watch any TV crime shows either, they simply employed probably the laziest investigation ever mounted. And it still worked, to be fair. This results in a very strange execution of some horrendous justice, if you can call it that. Who knows? Okay, let's go. Meanwhile, Billings and Wood hastened towards the river, a long walk from the present-day Oxford Street down to Whitehall. It was nearly midnight. People of that time tended to go to bed early, and the watch were likely to challenge people who were out after midnight. Billings must have looked as if he was pregnant, with the pail under his great coat. They reached Whitehall, but the dock gates had already been closed. The tide was out, and the foreshore of a river was mostly mud. Wading across that would attract attention. They walked on along the river past Westminster to the Horse Ferry Wharf, at the end of the present Horse Ferry Road under Lambeth Bridge. They went to the end of the dock and threw their head over. Instead of a splash, there was a thud as it landed on the mud. But they were too frightened to worry. They threw the bucket after it and hurried away. The night watchman on the wharf heard the thud, and a man on board on a boat saw them throw the bucket. But it was a dark night and no one was very curious. Billings and Wood hastened back home, now feeling slightly better. They found Catherine Hayes still scraping at the floorboards, trying not to make too much noise. The headless body still lay across the bed. The two men made up a makeshift bed in the other room and tried to sleep. Catherine Hayes sat by them, brooding. She must have been wishing that they had disfigured the face with a knife to prevent recognition. But with luck, the head was already on its way out to sea. She was still sitting there when the two men woke up at dawn. And also at dawn, the night watchman, a Mr. Robinson, walked to the edge of the dock to stretch his legs, and saw the bucket and the head lying in the mud. A small crowd soon gathered, and a lighterman from the boat mentioned seeing a man throwing the bucket into the river. Back in the lodgings, the murderers were discussing what to do with the body. The first and most obvious thing was to conceal it in case somebody came into the room. Mrs. Hayes went out and got a large box, but it was not big enough. They cut off the arms and the legs at the knees, but the body was still too long. They hacked off the thighs and finally managed to pack most of the pieces into the box, leaving some of the smaller items in an old blanket. That evening at 9 o'clock, Wood and Billings crept downstairs with the trunk in a blanket. It was early and there were too many people about, but they were not going to risk being stopped by the watch. This time they went north. Fortunately, there was not far to go before they were in the fields of Marylebone. They tossed the trunk into a pond that Wood had located during the day, then went back and collected the rest of the body. It was Mrs. Springate who let them in at midnight. Fortunately, she had no reason to be suspicious, even though her husband had found clots of blood in the drain that morning. Blood was common enough. The next day, Wood made off to the country to soothe his shattered nerves. Billings resumed his place in his mistress's bed. The parish officers of Westminster had not been idle. They ordered the blood and dirt to be washed from the head, and a macabre touch, the hair to be combed. Then the head was set on a stake at St. Margaret's Churchyard in Westminster. It drew a fascinated crowd, but no one recognized it. But the next day a young apprentice named Bennet saw it, and flew to tell Catherine Hayes that he thought it looked like her husband. She told him angrily that he could get himself into serious trouble if he spread such reports. Her husband was alive and well. Bonnet apologized and promised to say nothing about it. And a Mr. Patrick also thought he recognized the head and went along to a pub called the Dog and Dial in Monmouth Street, at which Hayes and his wife used to drink. to mention his suspicion. Billings happened to be working there at the time, and someone replied that the head couldn't belong to John Hayes because Billings was his lodger and he wouldn't know if anything had happened to Hayes. Billings immediately confirmed this, saying that he had left Hayes in bed that morning. Mrs. Hayes must have been feeling nervous, but she recognized that flight would be a mistake. When a neighbor asked after her husband, she said he was out taking a walk. The visitor mentioned the head in the churchyard, and Mrs. Hayes expressed horror at the wickedness of the age. Quote, "Why, they even say they found bits of a woman's body in a pond at Marylebone," end quote, she declared, and the neighbor said she hadn't heard about that. Wood came back to town on the 5th, 2 days after he had fled. Catherine Hayes gave him some of her husband's clothes and 5 shillings. She told him that the head had been found, but that no one had yet identified it. The head was beginning to stink. Worse still, the features were already beginning to turn black. The parish officers had it placed in a large jar full of spirit, perhaps gin, and continued to exhibit it to anyone who was interested. For a short period, it looked as if the mystery was solved when a woman said she thought it was her husband, but after a long look at it, she said she couldn't swear to it. Catherine Hayes remained remarkably cool. Less than a week after the murder, she left her lodgings and moved to another in the neighborhood, taking Billings, Wood, and Mrs. Springate. No doubt she was afraid that the latter might gossip. She even paid a quarter's rent for the lady. She then proceeded to collect as many of her husband's debts as possible, even in threatening to sue her husband's brother-in-law for money he owed. She wrote various letters in her husband's name to other debtors. Inevitably, Hayes' friends began to wonder what had become of him. A man called Ashby called on her to inquire. She then told him in strict confidence that her husband had killed a man in a quarrel and had fled to Portugal. Mr. Ashby asked if the head found in the river belonged to the murdered man, but Mrs. Hayes said no, they had buried the body entire. All this was bound to arouse suspicion. Ashby communicated with a neighbor who had already inquired. They talked with another neighbor, and finally a justice of the peace was informed. They hurried to Catherine's lodgings and knocked on the door. She was in bed with Billings. She dressed and went to the door. Billings was sitting on the edge of the bed without shoes or stockings when the officers came in. When asked if he had been sleeping with her, he said no, he was mending his stockings. The justice remarked that he must have been doing it in the dark, since there was no candle or fire. Wood was not present, but they arrested Catherine Hayes, Billings, and Miss Springate, and took them off to different prisons to prevent them from concocting a story. Catherine Hayes continued to assert her innocence and asked if she might see the head from the churchyard. The justice agreed, and they took her to the barber surgeon, Mr. Westbrook, who was keeping the head. There Catherine Hayes called upon all her histrionic powers and shouted, "Oh, it is my dear husband's head," and proceeded to kiss the jar. Mr. Westbrook came in and said he would take the head out of the jar. It was generally believed in those days that murderers would reveal their guilt if forced to touch the corpse. But Catherine Hayes was equal to anything. She seized the head and kissed it, then asked if she could have a lock of its hair. Her performance must have been a little too dramatic. The barber surgeon replied sardonically that she had already had too much of his blood, at which Catherine Hayes fainted or pretended to. She had already run through the emotional spectrum. It was the only thing left for her to do. Yeah, for sure. While all this was taking place, someone saw the blanket floating in the Marylebone pond and pulled it out. The rest of the body was soon recovered, but Catherine Hayes and Thomas Billings continued to assert their total innocence. Wood was the weak link in the chain. On the following Sunday, he came back to London from Harrow and went along to Catherine Hayes' old lodgings. They told him she had moved to a house nearby, and someone offered to show him. His informant took him to the wrong place, to the house of Mr. Longmore, one of the neighbors who had caused the arrest. There, the terrified Wood was dragged off his horse and taken to the justice, who had been questioning the others. At first Wood declared himself innocent, but in Newgate his nerve broke and he made a full confession. He explained that Mrs. Hayes had told him that her husband was an atheist and free thinker, and that it would be no more sin to kill him than to kill a dog. When the other two were told of the confession, they decided that there was no further point in keeping silent, especially as it might lead to torture, and also confessed. Mrs. Springate was released. It was after this that Catherine Hayes suddenly realized that the charge against her was not of murder, but petty treason, the killing of her lord and master, and that the penalty for this was to be burned alive. But she still hoped that her crime might be regarded simply as murder, since she had not struck any of the blows that killed her husband. At the trial, with the fear of a painful death hanging over her, she denied that she had any hand in the actual killing of her husband, and said that she had kept silent only because she was afraid that Wood and Billings would kill her too. When it was clear that all three would be sentenced to death, Wood and Billings begged that they might not be hanged in chains, and she again repeated her plea to be hanged rather than burned. But the judge sentenced her to be burned, and she screamed all the way back to Newgate. She revealed a better side to her nature before her execution. She sent messages to her two ex-lovers regretting that she had involved them in all this. When she saw Billings in chapel, she sat holding his hand and leaned her head on his shoulder. She was obviously in love with Billings. A few days after her execution, she somehow managed to get a bottle of acid into her... A few days before her execution, she somehow managed to get a bottle of acid into her cell. Unfortunately, a fellow prisoner saw it and tasted it. Unfortunately, a fellow prisoner saw it and tasted it. A little spilt on a handkerchief burnt it, so the prisoner smashed the bottle on the floor. Wood caught a fever in prison and died before he could be executed. He is the only person in the case who seemed to deserve much sympathy. His age is not recorded, but it seems fairly certain that he was still in his teens. He seems to have been a good-natured, easygoing young man who was too easily influenced. Billings was also young. Osborne records that when he first came to stay at the Hayes lodgings, there was a rumor that he was Catherine Hayes' son by a previous, quote, connection. He was executed before Catherine Hayes, and when the executioner, Richard Arnott, Laughing Jack's predecessor, came to fetch her, she asked him if he had killed her dear child yet. Quote, dear child yet. Her last moments give the case a final touch of horror. It was customary to strangle a woman condemned for petty treason before burning her. Arnott lit the brushwood around her, then started to pull the strangling rope from behind, but the fire reached his hands too quickly and he had to let go. The spectators watched her trying to push the burning timber away while she screamed. More timber was thrown on to try to put her out of her misery soon. But, says Wilkinson, she survived amidst the flames for a considerable time, and her body was not perfectly reduced to ashes in less than 3 hours. 3